Okay, welcome everyone. As you know, we, the Presbytery of Coastal Carolina, are very concerned about your churches, the ministry and the work you do there. But we also concerned about your insurance coverage. So we as a sub-team of the mission cabinet of the Presbytery, Ivy and I, also Helene Church was not with us, and of course Gerard Laurie, our steady clerk. We have been meeting and discussing what steps we should take in planning this time, which you are here tonight. To talk about your insurance here, we will talk about what your concerns and needs are for your church. So we'll let Ivy at this time introduce our presenter, and we'll go from there.
Good evening, everyone. I'm glad you all were able to join us tonight. I would like to introduce Mrs. Emily Hall. She works for Crystal Frey Davis State Farm Insurance Company. And I have the pleasure of having a personal knowledge of Emily. I've known Emily since she was in high school. And she was one of my students, I'm proud to say. And so I'm going to let her tell a little bit more about herself and what she does at State Farm. And if I know her boss is in the background, my friend Crystal Giveaway.
She actually just stepped out for a second. So she'll be back in a minute.
All right. Well, I'm going to let Emily get started. At any time you all have questions, if you can put them in the chat or if you can raise your hand, I will, if you put the questions in the chat, that would be great. If you can't put them in the chat because you're on the phone, just raise your hand and I will sort of stop that you ask your question. And Emily and I have this thing, we worked this out pre-arranged that if there's a question she doesn't have an answer for, I'm going to write it down, send it to her. She's going to get an answer. And if you all will email me your question, email your information, I'll get it back to you, or we'll put it on the website. Mm-hmm. Laura's coming on. Paula, you had a question. You have your hand up.
No, I'm good.
Okay. All right. Emily?
Well, thank you for having me. It's an honor to help Miss Moraine out. I have a tremendous amount of love and respect for this woman. And the word professional, I'll accept that, but like State Farm has kind of gotten out of writing insurance for churches. We are not really in the market for it anymore. Mainly because of the structures. They're so detailed, and our risk for windstorm and hail is pretty dominant here. So State Farms has a mandatory percentage deductible for windstorm and hail at a minimum of 5%. On some of y'all's buildings, they're $1 million buildings, so that's a very big deductible. So we're not really in the market, but I try to stay in touch with it. But I'll start with, well, I've been with State Farm for 25 years now. I've been with Crystal since she moved here and started the agency here. I've been with Crystal since she's opened. Love working for Crystal. I am married to my best friend, and we have 2 daughters, and I have 2 beautiful, beautiful grandchildren that I just adore. But I'll go ahead and get started. If y'all have any questions, just let me know and I'll try to answer them. And like Miss Moraine said, if I can't answer it, we're going to write it down and I'm going to find the answer for you. Pretty much all policies come with 3 basic coverages. You have your property coverage, which is the church itself, the building. And then you're going to have your contents. Your business property inside, that's going to be your sound equipment, your organs, your pews, not just office equipment. It's all the business property in there. The best way to describe that is if you could turn it upside down and shake it and it fall out, that's going to be business property. If it doesn't, if it's permanently attached, it's part of the structure. So that's your building coverage. And then one of the most critical coverages that there is the liability insurance. And then we can also briefly talk about the commercial auto insurance. If your church has vans or buses for youth, or y'all go on field trips or anything, and then also workers' compensation is very important. But I assume that we're mainly concerned about property coverage. Is that correct? And there are some major concerns that we have for building coverage is the specialties, not just the structure itself, but there's special endorsements that need to be added for like stained glass windows. They'll ask you the percentage of windows you have because they're one of the highest things that are vandalized or damaged and hard to replace. And also the we'll talk about some different endorsements that you might want to add for the actual congregation. We'll talk about volunteers, how they affect your policies. But some of the main endorsements that you might need under a church policy as well is directors and officers, sexual misconduct, employment practices, and even there's an endorsement. I don't think State Farm has this particular one, but is religious freedom. To start off, do you have any questions concerning what, like, as far as what's considered building coverage for your churches? Do you have an understanding of what the actual building is itself versus what's considered personal or business property? What are the main risks y'all are concerned about? What has triggered y'all to have this meeting? What are you finding out that the churches are lacking?
We haven't had a recent appraisal for our building. How do we go about getting that?
Getting an appraisal for the building? A lot of insurance, you wouldn't, if you're trying to determine how much coverage your building, the church itself should have. A lot of insurance companies, you don't necessarily have to have a professional appraisal done on it. Most insurance companies have an exactware tool that they can plug in the percentage, they can plug in the square footage, the building material. They'll ask you like what percentage of it is glass, and they'll help determine a cost estimate for you. And it's pretty accurate from what I can tell. And a lot of times the insurance companies, when I was writing a lot of churches, our field underwriter, we would actually go and visit the churches and walk around and see some of the details ourselves, so we could automatically kind of help with the amount of coverage you should have. Because you do want to take into consideration that insurance is designed to put you back where you were before a loss. And if you're not, and unfortunately the inflation, in the building cost, the inability to get materials immediately, finding the proper people to do the repairs and work, all this is affecting our rising costs for rebuilding. And even if you're concerned about, just if you contact the company, you say, well, our main concern is being able to replace the roof if a hurricane comes through, because that's the number one damage we have in this area is roof damage. We can't look at it that way. We've got to look at what it's going to take to rebuild the entire property in the event of the loss. We can't just insure certain features of your church. We've got to look at what it would take to rebuild it. So we got to take into consideration your building materials. So many of the churches here in Wilmington, they have such a history and age to them that it's kind of hard to determine or replace it with the same type of building material. So having a cost estimate done, any insurance company that you call should be able to help you with that. But I would assume that if you want something more, I guess, in detail, a contractor can come out and do an appraisal. And any insurance company should be able to use that appraisal. And that appraisal is going to break down the building versus the land value, because in an insurance company's eyes, land is not an insurable interest, just the structure itself. So a lot of times you will look at, and we can't look at market value, we can't look at tax value, we got to look at what it's going to take to rebuild. The appraisals, a lot of times, just make sure that if you do have an appraisal done, that they actually separate the land value from the total cost, because we got to look at the structure itself. But the main things that you're going to have that's going to be protected on your basic perils are going to be, of course, fire, smoke damage, freezing of pipes, sudden discharge of water. In this area, in the coastal area, I don't know if, are we all here local in Wilmington?
No.
No,
Okay. Well, Wilmington is our major factor that affects our rates is, of course, named storms. A lot of times once you get past a certain zip code, that doesn't really affect the policy. But here locally, windstorm is a huge factor. So a lot of times you just check the policy good and make sure it's going to automatically exclude any earthquake. That's an added endorsement in North Carolina. Here, coastal, a lot of companies are going to automatically exclude windstorm and hail. All these perils are a covered peril except by exclusion by endorsement. So just make sure you check the policy really well, and that you're not missing everything. Flood is excluded from all policies. That's the National Flood Insurance Program. FEMA handles flood insurance. It's excluded from all policies. So depending on where you're located, flood should be a factor that you consider. We're technically all in a flood zone. Now some risks are higher than others, but if you look at statistics, I think it's over 60% of flood claims happen in what they consider preferred risk flood zones, meaning that it's not likely to flood. Those are usually where you see the most flood damage. So always consider flood insurance. Rising water is a huge loss. It's hard to take care of and put back properly. So make sure you have the flood insurance as well, or at least consider that. Your contents, the building itself, make sure it has replacement costs. You don't want to have an actual cash value policy. That can really diminish what you can get from your policy in the event of a loss. Now your building contents is going to be your church pews, your office equipment, your schools, if you have them in there, or the after school programs or any nurseries, sound equipment, all of those things are going to be considered your business property. Do you have any questions so far, or on any covered perils?
I have a question.
Okay.
So do you get extra points? I know sometimes you get points added, or is there anything, if you have certain things in place? I heard you say endorsements, and I'm just ignorant, don't know. So can you explain the endorsements and what that means?
Well, you can have the endorsements for building is going to apply to endorsements to exclude. exclude earthquake. You've got to add an endorsement to
Okay.
cover for earthquake. You've got to have an endorsement
Okay,
to
gotcha.
exclude windstorm and hail. But now the other special endorsements you can add to a church policy, or is going to affect like the liability portion of it. So, I mean, churches unfortunately are under attack, it seems. So liability to me is a huge factor as well. I'm a huge fan of protecting the liability. Somebody can take something and completely turn it around and sue you for it. So the endorsements that you can add for certain things is going to apply to the liability primarily. But the building, you want to just make sure that you have the proper amount of stated value for the building itself, and then have replacement cost. Because in North Carolina, replacement cost the definition 100% replacement cost was removed back in 97. We no longer have that. That primarily came after the hurricanes Fran and Bertha that rolled through here. When you have a catastrophic event like that take place and you have thousands of claims going on, a lot of contractors, because of the demand, can charge whatever they want. The way our policies read, no matter what they charged, your policy had to pay it if it had replacement cost. So you probably hear that, definition a lot. Does it have 100% replacement cost? I'm not aware of any policy in North Carolina now that has that definition in the policy anymore. It's capped. There's a mandatory inflation endorsement in North Carolina, so your policy should grow a little bit in coverage each year because replacement cost is capped at a percentage. For State Farm, it's 25%. It might vary from other companies, but with State Farm, it's 25%. That's mainly to kind of deter gouging to take place during catastrophic events. It's kind of to help eliminate that. North Carolina took that into, the Department of Insurance took that into account and made it back in 1997, I believe it was.
What
So
about-
I'm sorry.
I have a question.
Mhm.
What about a flood from a water line burst accidentally? What about that?
That is going to actually be classified as sudden discharge of water. So that should be a primary policy. Flood is going to be defined as rising water from ground up. If you have a pipe that bursts in the church and no one's during the middle of the week and no one's there and water's running into it, that actually did not come from any type of rising water. That came from a sudden discharge. So that should actually be covered under under the primary policy.
Okay.
Flood is going to strictly be just rising water or a surge.
Okay.
Not if a storm comes through and tears a hole in the roof and rain pours in, that still did not rise. That source of damage came from the wind blowing a hole through the roof. So rain pouring in that way is not going to be defined as a flood. But you also have to be careful with FEMA. They've got to come in and actually declare it a flood. It's got to affect more than just your property or 2 acres, depending on how much land your church sits on. It's got to affect someone else's, some other property. That could be the state-owned street in front of your church, but it does have to affect another property or 2 acres for them to come in and say this was a flood. If unfortunately there's a lot of rain and you just have a poor runoff, so it accumulates and kind of seeps under and gets in that way, they're not going to define that as a flood. So, and that's unfortunately a gap in coverage.
I have a question if I can.
Sorry,
I came in a little late. Does what you just said also apply to property that's owned by the church? Now, say if we had a resident off premises And does the same rules that you just talked about apply to that particular property as well?
I would imagine so, yes. I would imagine so. Now, if you have a structure that's on the church grounds, but not attached to the main structure, then that's going to be classified as other structures on the property. And it's normally a percentage of what the primary structure is covered for, or you can list it separately at a different amount. If it's at another location, that is something that you should be able to add by endorsement on your policy to extend to a premises off the location.
Thank you.
And one of the other factors that we all think about basic perils being covered against, like fire and smoke damage. But there's also other things that you need to kind of consider as, not just rising water, but power surges. If you can't, let's see, not just the natural disasters, but accidents from electrical surge in the wiring, vandalism, wind damage are going to be your main damages. But each policy that you have, it should give you a list of all the basic perils, and then it should also tell you what's excluded on your particular policy. I would just read through that very carefully and make sure it's not something you can pick up on by endorsement, because one of the exclusions in this area that a lot of people don't realize is if the septic's back up and you have a backup of sewer and drains, that's a very messy claim, and that is something that has to be added by endorsement. Most companies do not automatically include, you would think they would, but does not include automatic backup of any type of sewer and drains, which could be a very messy claim and cause a lot of damage. Especially with seems like the amount of rain that we've had this year, seems like we've had quite a few of those, just where the water is just not draining off properly and it affects the lines, and people have some major, especially with older plumbing as well. You just need to read through your policy and make sure you've got that endorsement as well. So with State Farm, like if you would have to have the main church policy, which is going to automatically include, we don't have the ability to exclude wind and hail from our church policies, but also watch your deductibles. I know there's some companies, like with State Farm, our minimum wind deductible is 5%. That is, depending on the value of your church, that could be a very, very large deductible in the event of a tornado or hurricane. Some companies have where you can also insure the deductible. So if you end up with a $10,000 to $20,000 deductible, your church has to pay that before the policy will make any of the repairs. That's quite a bit, that could damage some smaller churches, pretty quickly. So I would, if you are one of the churches that has a really high deductible, to help with the actual cost of the policy, because of course the higher our deductible, the less the premium is, because you're taking on a good bit of the risk yourself as a congregation. But you can also look in to see if they have an endorsement that actually insures the deductible. So they will cover the higher portion of the deductible and kind of limit it and make it more affordable, where you end up with maybe like $1,000 deductible that can step in. So that might be something y'all want to look at as well.
Anybody have any questions at this point? Okay.
Our congregation has a large building. So if the building was destroyed, we wouldn't want to replace it. We would rebuild at a smaller capacity. For instance, we have three stories if you include the basement, but the second story, we don't use at all anymore. So we would be rebuilding a smaller church facility. Does that affect anything?
No, I mean, they would most likely allow you to do that. I mean, they're just not going to allow you to build something better than what it's designed to put it where it was before the loss, not to better you before the loss.
Right.
So, you know, if you have your building insured for $1 million and you have a total loss and you want to build a smaller church and it's going to cost $500,000 to rebuild the smaller church, then I don't see how they can kind of keep you from doing that. But there would, even though you paid for $1 million policy, you would not get that difference. They would stop. I mean, they're going to pay what it is that needs to be rebuilt. They're not going to, even though your policy was for $1 million, they're not going to give you that difference.
So can we insure the church for less for what would be the replacement cost?
Not, the only way you can do that is if you sign off on not having replacement costs, that it's an actual cash value, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's just going to allow you to rebuild a smaller church. I would think that would be very difficult to do, because we've got to look at what it takes to rebuild you where you are currently. And I mean, and even if we say, well, you know, they had a total loss, they're only going to build, you know, they're going to build a church half the size. There's nothing in your contract that's going to state that you're going to do that. They have to strictly go by the contract on what you currently have. So I would imagine I can't see an insurance company allowing you to insure. If you have $1 million building and you say, well, you know, we only want to insure because we're going to build a smaller church, so we only want 500,000. I don't see how that could go through underwriting without a lot of questions, because it's designed to build it back the way you have it.
Okay.
And sometimes I know with flood insurance, if you know, your church is like yours is, like you said, it was 2 or 3 stories. And you think, well, you know, if we do have a flood, it's only going to come up in the first level. There's no way it's going to come to the second level. So you insure what half of your church there, then you're going to have co-insurance apply. If you're insuring only 50% of your church, they'll only pay 50% of your claim. That will trigger co-insurance. And that may be the case. It's not for State Farm. I would personally have a hard time getting underwriting to approve insuring your church for less than what it would take to replace it. But some companies, they may allow that, but I would make sure that you wouldn't have co-insurance apply.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
What about if they want to do an addition to the building, say if they receive the money to replace the building, but they want to do an additional work or to expand? How would that work?
Ms. Moraine, that is a question that I don't know how a contract will allow you to change up too much from what you currently have. That is a question I can look into and try to find an answer. If you just completely alter the building, I don't know how that will fully affect the contract that you have. So that will be one that I can look into and get a better answer for.
Gotcha. Got it. Laura
The
has a question.
The question I have is, if directors and officers insurance, so I kind of want to maybe move us a little bit different direction. Directors and officers insurance in a church, is that different from other nonprofits, or do churches need to have directors and officer coverage?
I would recommend it. Yes. I would recommend it because you're accepting in money from, from tithing and things like that, or donations. Yes, I would think directors and officers is very important for a church.
Would that be a separate policy or just an endorsement?
It should be an endorsement. And some companies do consider that a specialty product, but it could also be added by endorsement, I would think.
So a part B to that would be misconduct insurance, pastoral misconduct. Can you speak to that?
The sexual misconduct is a common question, and that should too be an endorsement. I would definitely make sure, especially if you're doing any type of counseling or anything like that, that sexual misconduct endorsement would be, I'm a huge person when it comes to the liability and the risk there. So I would definitely want to make sure, if I was responsible for that, I would want to make sure I had that endorsement on my policy. Absolutely.
How much would what would be the coverage, the amount for that? coverage?
I would recommend $1 million. That's the most common.
Okay.
And maybe, your church liability policy is going to be part of the main church policy that you have, is that the liability. That should probably be stated at maybe 500,000 to $1 million. And then you might want to consider an umbrella at that point too, especially if you have a large youth group. And you go on a lot of, I was a youth leader for my church, and that was one of the things, and coming from insurance, that was always on my mind. We were taking our teams on ski trips, mission work, and things like that. And, we always place these golden rules. My husband and I did it, he didn't drive any of the girls, and I didn't drive any of the boys, just to make sure. But it's just one of those things that, somebody can just take the wrong way and come after you personally. So I definitely recommend having the directors and officers make sure it has the sexual misconduct, endorsement on there. Even though you set rules in place and make sure it's balanced and proper, people just sometimes can just take things the wrong way.
Okay.
One of the things with liability as well, a lot of times we have, I was a member of the church, member of our church, but I wasn't on the payroll for the youth. It was something that, a service that my husband and I wanted to, do. So we weren't on the payroll for the church. So make sure that if you have volunteers, if they're volunteering for these groups, they are covered under the church policy. If you are having events and a church member wants to have a wedding or a funeral, if they are a member, they should be covered under the liability policy. But if it is a non-member and they want to have a wedding at your church or a funeral at your church, make sure that they purchase event insurance, because if they're not a member of the church, they're not going to be covered under the policy. They've got to be
that's surprising right there.
Yeah,
That's surprising. It's wow. I have to give a big wow to that.
I didn't realize that either.
I've never heard that. I never thought about it.
Same here. That is news.
Can you get an endorsement to say all funerals at the church are covered? Because the people coming are members of the church or connected to the church somehow. But you're saying
you got to. Now for for a funeral, I'm not really sure how to answer that, because it's usually like for a wedding, it would be like the guest of honor, like the bride and groom. If the bride or the groom is a member of the church, then their event is covered. If but for a funeral, I don't know how to answer. I don't know if the guest of honor would be, for the person that you're there celebrate, their life celebration. Not 100% sure. That is a question that I can ask about. I can find out about that as well. But it's not necessarily the guests that are coming to the wedding or the guests that are attending the funeral. You got to think of the guest of honor. Like
So I have a question regarding that. So we do a contract with anybody we do a contract with members as well as non-members who use our facility.
Mm-hmm. Your members are covered. Your non-members I would make them have event insurance.
Gotcha.
Is the event insurance expensive or is it?
No, I mean, we don't personally sell it. But I know you can purchase it online, or I think AAA is a company here locally that can sell it. But we've never gotten into event insurance, but that would be how you determine that. If you're allowing a church member to get married there, then their event should be covered. But a non-member that you contract through, I would make sure they have event insurance.
I gotcha. It's the same thing with the sororities and fraternities. Even though we're invited to be on the campus of UNCW, our organization provides insurance policy, a liability insurance policy that we have to have on file with the university. So it's the same concept. I got it.
I got a question. I think I'm a little confused. What does it mean? What is the event insurance covering? Like
it's a liability that covers the event. It depends if yeah, let's say, for example, the wedding tries to do, like, they contract through and they're doing like sparklers or something like that, and somebody gets injured. It's not necessarily the negligence of the church that y'all didn't do anything wrong. Y'all allowed them to come in and participate in that. So you want to be able to make sure you have something that you can subrogate against, because if that guest member is injured, or that guest, not member, but if that guest is injured and they're sitting in your church, that's going to be their first person they go to for a claim. And you want to make sure that if that happens to you, you can provide a certificate that says, yes, but it wasn't our congregation. It wasn't any negligence on the church itself. And your church policy can have something they can subrogate against on another policy. But if it's a member, then it should be covered under your liability, because your liability is only going to pay if you're negligent, if your church is negligent. And if you have a non-member getting married at your church or having a funeral and someone's injured and you file a claim with your church policy, they may deny it. And you just want to make sure that you have something that you can subrogate against and go after to cover those damages.
In the same vein, is there a difference between, let's say, a wedding or a funeral event and a meeting? If let's say we allow the fraternity to come in and just have a meeting. Now,
event. It's an event.
That's considered an event.
Mm-hmm. It's an event.
Ooh, okay.
I mean, that is something that you might want to just, with some of this discussion that I'm having, if it's triggering you're thinking about what your church does, that might just kind of trigger, some questions that you can actually reach out to your carrier and make sure that, hey, look, I just want y'all to be aware that we allow a fraternity in here once a month to have a meeting. If anything goes wrong, if will my liability cover it if someone is injured? Now, if they're walking up the steps and there's a loose brick on the steps, so they fall, that's negligence of the church. That's not something. But if those, like going back to my example, if that wedding is doing sparklers and a sparkler stick pokes someone's eye, that's not negligence on the church. That's negligence on the event. So that's why I would just make sure that if you are allowing non-members have meetings and events like that and funerals, just make sure your liability policy will cover those events.
Okay.
And I don't know how in depth y'all want to get into it, but workers' compensation is, a huge thing. If you've got workers' compensation is only going to be designed if someone is a W-2, if they're on the payroll for the church. If a volunteer is injured, during, some type of mission work or something you're doing, they're not covered by workers' comp. They're going to come to the church for liability.
Mhm.
So I would keep that in mind for liability as well.
Well, what is general liability? I would have thought general liability would have taken care of a lot of this.
It does take a lot of it, but you want to just, you just want to make sure. That's why I recommend you going to your actual carrier and recommend, asking them if you are doing these meetings and if you are allowing weddings for non-members, and another thing, or if, I don't know if any of you have schools in your church, or if you rent out certain areas, if the school is, if somebody's renting rooms or part of your church to have schools, it's a separate entity. You just got to be careful with the liability. The liability is the major gray area. I mean, if the church is insured properly and you have a fire, your policy is most likely, after the deductible, going to take care of the damages. But the liability that unfortunately can kind of come into play can cause a lot of gray areas. That's what I would, my number one advice is to make sure your church is insured properly, that it can be replaced. And make sure you go through your property really well and kind of get a true value on if you lost everything that you had in there. Your basic perils are going to cover that. You're going to know what your policy covers and what it doesn't cover. You have your deductible, so that has to be absorbed first, and then they're going to pay after that. But the liability, there's a lot of gray area in the liability.
Mhm. I have another
And
question.
like, how do you know how much to buy? I mean,
Mhm.
this event liability, what do you recommend?
I would say probably I would imagine most liability packages come in 100,000, 300,000, 500,000, or $1 million. I mean, if you've got somebody that's having a major, a major event at the church, I would, a lot of times I would just require $1 million.
Mhm.
So can I ask, so are we saying the church needs to have this insurance, or the people who are having the event should have this insurance?
I recommend first checking with your carrier. If
Okay.
they may have automatically, I don't know when you did the application for your church policy, that's some of the questions they ask. Do you do fundraisers? Do you do meetings? I mean, they're asking those to make sure that there might be a very minimal coverage onto it, or it might be excluded. So at first I recommend checking with your carrier. If you're having, a lot of weddings or funerals, or allowing people to come in and do meetings, or if you have schools, check and make sure on that, how the liability will come into play. But I would imagine most of you I would personally not write any, if I was writing your church policy, honestly, I wouldn't even ask you if you wanted 300,000, 500,000, or $1 million. I'd put $1 million on there, because the liability cost isn't the major factor in the premium. That's the minimum part of it. Actually, the building coverage is in business property is the majority of your premium. I just think it's a better night's sleep having at least $1 million. But if they do tell you, yeah, that's right. If you're allowing non-members to come in and do this and do that, then, and they say the liability will not extend to it, then, that's when I would, when you have a contract with them to allow them to have their wedding or have their funeral or have their monthly meetings, I would want to see that they have liability in place.
Okay. Well, what about another question? What about taking trips and you're taking, say, the youth who are not members of the church? What about that?
That's Miss Moraine, that's put that question down. I know for the youth that are part of the church, I know we personally would have a night where we'd say, hey, you got to come and bring 2 friends. But no, personally, we were strict on they had to be a part of the church to actually go on to the youth trips. So I'm not exactly sure how if your youth member brings a friend, I'm not exactly sure. I would check with your carrier, and I can look a little bit further into that and get that one answered as well.
Okay.
But if you have vans and things like that, just make sure the vans you have the commercial auto insurance properly insured as well. And some church policies have an endorsement where they can extend to like some of the coverage to the vans, but the actual, that kind of broadens the difference from the actual auto liability. They have additional endorsements that they can add for that if that's taking place a lot.
Does it make a difference the size of the van?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Some, I think it's a 15 passenger. If it's 15 or more, that I know State Farm won't do it. It's a different type of policy. But if it's like a, traditional passenger van, I think those are eligible, but that is something that I would check. But yes, the number of passengers that can be placed in that vehicle would be a factor in it.
What about renting a vehicle, a van or a bus?
That you would have to check with your church carrier, like with us in that particular case. Renting a vehicle is only for personal use and a private passenger. We wouldn't be able to extend coverage or confirm that you have coverage if you ended up renting a van or something. You would have to purchase that rental company's insurance. But I mean, that's State Farm. That I'm not 100% sure. That may be different with the carrier that you're with. But that is something, if you're renting a vehicle, I would check that.
Along these lines, if we have a youth function and we're all going to gather at the church, and then we're going to pile into 4 or 5 personal vehicles and drive over to the bowling alley together. Describe the insurance in that transportation scenario.
That's make sure your church policy includes non-owned vehicles. It's called non-owners. The church doesn't own the actual vehicle, but they're driving for the church. That's gonna, I would check that with your policy that you have and make sure it's, that endorsement covers non-owned.
Mhm. And usually what the coverage price for that? You don't know.
No, I don't know. I wouldn't be able to
Mhm.
answer that. I mean, usually our commercial autos are pretty reasonable, but we don't write if we don't write the 15 passengers. That's just something State Farm sees a lot of liability in, high risk, and so we won't do it. So I don't, unfortunately, I don't know too much about that, but if you have some questions, I can definitely find out the answer for you, based in general, but each company may be different for that.
Okay, thank you.
And may I ask a question about bonding? So in our polity, when people are counting the offering, it can be two unrelated people or one person who is fidelity bonded. And what does it mean to be bonded? What does that look like if a church wanted to bond, have a bond on somebody and let them count the money by themselves?
I mean, you can. Crystal, can you help me? Yes, I'm gonna get Miss Crystal to help with that one. Okay. I'm gonna close you out. Okay.
Hello, hello. I've been listening from afar. We offer fidelity bonds. So like say with the sorority, Ivy, all of the people who are
Handling the money.
responsible for the finances or handling money are bonded, and you can choose different amounts that you want to bond them for. Basically, we're saying that we will replace this money up to a certain amount. So it's 25,000 or 50,000 or whatever amount that you want. And they have to fill out that fidelity bond questionnaire. And we do run a check on them to make sure that they have the character to warrant the bond. We do get their social security number and check to make sure that they don't have any issues of financial impropriety on their background or their credit.
So the bonding is individual and not on the office itself. For example, our treasurer, just the mere fact that the person is treasurer, are they bonded? Are they generally bonded? Just because
Generally, you bond your treasurer, but I know we don't bond offices. We bond people in those offices because we want to make sure that the people that we are guaranteeing are trustworthy as individuals. So you and I don't mean this as any kind of insult, but he might be a good treasurer, but still have sticky fingers. So we have to check that out before we agree to guarantee that person for 25 and 50,000 or more. We do get that request a lot to bond offices, even in our organization, but we want to check out that individual in that office. And as the person changes, as the new treasurer comes on board, we take off the old treasurer. We get a new fidelity bond questionnaire for the new treasurer, and we just change that information on the same bond. So we can do it.
Crystal, let me ask this question. Would you
Mhm.
say all of the insurance companies would practice it, have that practice, or is every company different?
Every company is different. Every
Okay.
company is different. It's been a while since I've encountered one that will bond the position. It's just the loss chances are so much higher without verifying that individual. I wanted to circle back around to a couple of things. And then y'all, I gotta let Emily go home. She's been at work since early this morning. We started out early this morning. We went to a blood drive, and then we went to Brunswick Community College and did a presentation down there. And she's on overtime hours now, so I'm gonna send her home. But somebody was asking about meetings at the church for the fraternity.
Yes.
So our national organizations have liability insurance that extend. Locally, we have our own insurance policy because we also have a property. So we have property coverage and we have liability coverage locally. But your national organizations have liability coverage that would extend to you. And of course, I want to give you this disclaimer. Each claim has to be evaluated on its own merits. So to determine where the liability lies. And I think that's what Emily was trying to say. My recommendation is that if you have coverage, that you actually read your policy, focus on the exclusions, because that's what catches people off guard. And they don't find out what's not covered until they have a claim.
So,
If you-
so the insurance of the fraternity or sorority would indemnify the church, correct?
If the liability arises out of your activities as an organization of your national organization,
Mm-hmm.
then you would look to that policy for coverage first.
Okay.
Okay.
So on this point, if a church has a regular meeting, and I'm going to use a slightly different example, Weight Watchers meets in a church I know about here.
Mhm.
Should the church have requested a certificate of insurance with the church named as also insured?
Yes,
And then
yes.
that can last for like a year or 2 years or whatever the term is. And then,
the term of the policy, yes.
yeah, and then they get a renewed certificate the next cycle. So with
Yes.
these national fraternities, you can get that certificate and it'll cover the meetings for the year. It's not like they need a policy or something
Right,
every meeting.
right. I mean,
That
it's
goes for any, and that goes for any organization, right?
Right.
Masonic
Mhm.
Lodge and all that.
Right.
Okay.
I mean, if you
All of those big organizations have those types of,
Coverage.
I mean, if we want to have an event at UNCW, we
need
have
to
to
ask for it.
produce a certificate of insurance. And you know, they have plenty of insurance, but they want to see our certificate of insurance.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Mhm. That's right.
All right, well, if anybody else has questions, you didn't get an answer, your questions didn't get answered, please email me or Clarence and I will get them to Crystal and Emily. We want to thank Crystal and Emily. I know you've had a long, long day because you and I have talked multiple times today.
I know.
So
I
I
know.
want to thank you. We will see you back on the 28th of November. And for those of you who have come, if you want to come back, then we were glad to have you back. And we want to thank you. Clarence, can you close us out in prayer, please?
Yes, may we pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for each person on this Zoom that represented each church. We thank you for the ministry they do. We thank you for our presenters. And as we continue to serve your people, Lord, we want to be equipped the way we should be to serve your people. And we thank you for this opportunity and we give you praise. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, just to be clear, the flyer said next Monday, the 21st.
I'll update it and resend it. I'll update it tonight and
Oh.
resend it.
Okay, so it is going to be the 28th, not the 21st.
Correct.
Yes.
They have a conflict, so they could not.
Okay,
Something came up.
I've
and they
got it
have
on
a
the
conflict.
website too, so I'll need to update it there as well.
Yeah, 28th, 6
Okay,
o'clock.
thank you.
All right,
Same
thank
lane.
you. Thank you for the
Thank you
opportunity.
both.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Crystal. I'll see you
welcome.
later, Crystal.
Okay, I know.
All
All right.
right, everybody. Y'all have a great evening.
Good
Have a
night.
good one. Okay. Is there anything we need to say?
Nope.
Okay.
I've got the questions and I'll type them up and send them to Emily in the morning.
Okay.
I'm gonna redo that flyer after I eat my dinner and then
Okay.
I'll
Okay.
so I thought it went well.
I think very
I hope it
good.
did.
Very
Yep.
good. And we will share this once we get it, where we can put it up on YouTube.
Okay. All right.
Oh,
Got
okay.
it.
All right then.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Good
Bye-bye.
night. Pray for
Good
your
night.
mother.
Thank you.
Okay.
All
Bye-bye.
right. Bye-bye.